Welcome to the Mischief Maker broadcast, where chaos, creativity, and common sense collide. Your host, Joel Freeman, was kicked out of high school in Alberta, Canada. He left home at 17 and hitchhiked around North America as a long-haired hippie and dope-smoking fool. He made a 180-degree change, becoming one of the first chaplains in the history of the NBA. As a professional speaker, Joel has traveled to well over 55 countries. His many books have been published in 28 foreign translations. Pieces from his Black History collection have been seen by millions at the United Nations and many other venues. And now, the Chief Mischief Maker himself, Dr. Joel A. Freeman.
Hi, Bigger Baby Joel here. You know, the older version of me went to a restaurant that serves breakfast at any time. So he ordered French toast during the Renaissance.
Well, I think that Bigger Baby Joel's ripped that off from Stephen Wright, the comedian. So homage to Stephen Wright, one of my favorite comedians. And I have in my hand here the belt that I designed. This is a full-size championship belt that is in honor of Jack Johnson, the boxer. He won the championship, world championship in 1908. And this is just my way of saying, hey, let's bring Jack Johnson into the forefront. Let's share this with the older generation, that he was bigger and badder than just boxing. And for the younger generation who maybe have never heard of him before, to have it become an educational tool, a gateway, if you will, to understanding more about him. Today, whenever you're watching this, we have a show for you. And it's, I have in my hand here a first edition copy from Doubleday of Alex Haley's Roots with a signature on it. And also, here's another edition that may cause you to remember the miniseries that was on worldwide, literally hundreds of millions of people. Well, let's say tens of millions. I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm sure it all adds up to a huge number of people around the world watching this. Back in the day, the first miniseries, it was just people were glued to their TV sets because we didn't have, a bazillion channels to look at and be in distractions. When people had just like one or two or three or four options, people actually had a shared water cooler experience, talking about it the next day, what they heard and what they saw on the Roots, the miniseries. So today we have Bill Haley Jr., Alex Haley's grandson. And it's going to be a fascinating show. I believe that you're going to learn a lot about Alex Haley, but I really want us to learn a lot about Bill Haley Jr., grandson, and just get a sense of who he is, what motivates him, what drives him, and just what it's like just to be the grandson of Alex Haley. How does he unpack that? So he's going to be with us in just a few moments, but right now, we're going to hear a song that actually started out as a written word piece. And then the more I looked at the words, I just thought, let's produce a kind of a blues, edgy song around it. It's called I'm History, and I'm sick and tired of repeating myself. Here it is.
I'm history, and I'm sick and tired of repeating myself. Been watching for centuries, seen it all unfold. Humans are humans, all from the same mold. I was there when Satan swelled with pride. I was also there when Jesus died. Been watching Africa, Israel, and Algeria, Russia, China, Persia, and Syria, England, Rome, the Huns and Bombay, Turkey, Greece, France, and the USA. From slavery's dark days to civil rights fought, Black history's chapters, battles hard fought, segregation, discrimination we must remember. But it's time to unite and make amends together. One thing I've seen since I was just a teen, a lot of good people outweigh the few evil. Break the chains, break the cycle. Let's move forward, let love be our revival. No more repeating the mistakes of the past. It's time for change, let's make it last. Tired, let's break free and embrace uncomfortability. No more ignoring, let's heal the divide. Learn from our past, let love be our guide. In America's story, chapters filled with pride, but also deliberate acts of shame we won't hide. Native land stolen, oppression and pain. It's time to acknowledge, it's time to reclaim. From the Civil War to battles for justice and peace, the fight for equality will never cease. We can't erase the past, but we can grow. Let's build a future where the truth will glow. I'm sick and tired of repeating myself, but hope lingers on. It's time to delve into a world where history's lessons we've learned. Let's rewrite the future, let humanity be heard. Break the chains, break the cycle. Let's move forward, let God bring revival. No more repeating the mistakes of the past. It's time for change, let's make it last. Break the chains, break the cycle. Let's move forward, let God bring revival. No more repeating the mistakes of the past. It's time for change, let's make it last.
Well, there we are. Break the chains, break the cycle. Bill Haley Jr., I just want to say something to our audience. In fact, we have Kent here. Do you think MAGA Republicans think about a song like that? It's needed now more than ever. Well, Kent, we don't. This is a politics-free zone, so we'll take that first half of your question. And I just think it's because I'm the kind of guy that I look at both sides. And I see, when I write a Black history curriculum, I write it as a love letter for both sides, 50%, not just 50%, 100%. And a song like that is for 100% and of the people. And so this is a politics-free zone, and that's just the way that I like it. And there's plenty of other people who do great jobs in the politics realm. So thank you, though, Kent. I really appreciate it. So anyone you have, just like you had our first question, our Mel will be making sure everything is germane to what our topic is this evening. Welcome to Bill Haley Jr. How are you?
I'm great, Joel, and I'm so happy to be on your show. I've been watching so many of them, so and they've all been wonderful. So I'm really privileged and honored to be a part of one of your shows tonight. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I appreciate it and look forward to our conversation.
It's my pleasure. It's an honor to have you on with us today. Now, I want to get to know, and I want us all to get to know you. But let's put a pin in that, because let's come through the gateway of your grandfather and your dad, who I got to know pretty well, traveled with, and loved him to pieces, miss him. I can't even begin to imagine how much you miss him. But just the whole idea of your granddad, when did you first realize that your grandfather was not just a writer, quote unquote, but a cultural figure, an icon? and in some cases, maybe they're kind of controversial in some corners.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll say it's. I had the sense even from an early age that my grandfather was a writer, um, but I didn't really understand, sort of even I didn't know like about his writing journey, his career. I do remember, I grew up in New York, and I remember, an image sticks in my mind. I went to like one of these little preschools or early age schools. It was like more of a Montessori school, and I remember, my dad telling me, "Oh, your grandfather is a writer, and he wrote this book." And the book that he was talking about back in that time, because I'm obviously an old dude now, was the autobiography of Malcolm X. So I remember looking at the book and being so incredibly astonished that I had a grandfather that had this book that, I probably couldn't even really read, but I remember taking it to the school to just carry with me, not as a show and tell thing, but because I was so proud of that. So I always had a sense that he was a writer of sorts. And even growing up through and before Roots, I remember him always being sort of busy, kind of running around here or there, like he was always somewhere else rather than, like near where I was. But I guess, even with Roots, I had the sense of a story being told. And my father would say, when Roots was being filmed and my grandfather was working on it, it was sort of like matter of factly, your grandfather is working on a story about the family. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then, when it was going to be a television show, he says, oh yeah, there's going to be a television show about the family. And I'm like, okay, it didn't really register with me. So it really wasn't until I would say Roots actually was broadcast that I had a sense of how shifting that was, because, I had the privilege, and I think my father and family did this very purposely, I was raised like an everyday kid. I grew up in New York. I, had friends. I didn't, think about fame or fortune or any of those things. I was an everyday kid. And, there was, I would call it the day before Roots broadcast. And then there was the day after Roots broadcast. And it was like a sea change. It was all of a sudden, there was this shift in that, all of a sudden I was someone who, I felt was, an average everyday kid. And then all of a sudden, I became the most popular kid in school, and I was bombarded with crazy questions. And I really had no idea what to expect. So it was really the day after Roots was broadcast that I really had a sense of how groundbreaking and how world changing that Roots could be. Other than that, I almost felt clueless about it, because I just thought it was this personal story about my family that other people were going to see.
Now bring us into the living room or whatever room you were in when you were watching that on television for the first time. How old were you?
I was 12.
12. Now bring us into the room, what you were feeling, experiencing as you were watching it. What was the visceral response you had as you were watching it?
It was a very interesting day. So I'm going to actually go a little bit before that same day, before the broadcast. My grandfather actually happened to be in New York, and he was speaking at the Harlem State Office building. There was this huge, book signing function. I remember seeing, these politicians and celebrities and all these people. It was like this huge party. But the reason I'm thinking about it, because it was January 23rd, 1977. And that was actually the day that he signed my own personal copy of Roots on that very day. And, I went to this function, and then he whisked away and went off to where he was. And actually, I saw the first episode of Roots in the living room of my maternal grandparents. So wow. It was really kind of nice that I was sitting in front of this television. I was with my maternal grandparents, and we were watching this story of my paternal ancestry at the same time. And I just remember the first episodes coming in. I just, it was almost, it felt magical. Like it almost didn't feel like, it was happening. It was, I remember the opening sequence, and I think it opened in the Gambia, and you saw the villagers and the women washing clothes and all these sort of things, and it was kind of like I was whisked away into the middle of this story, in a way that I had not known before. I mean, I knew about the American side, who my ancestors were in Tennessee, but I didn't know, about this sort of Kunta Kinteh side. So it was almost like a discovery and an odyssey. And I was like gripped and leaning forward into the television, probably like millions of other people. So it took a while for it to, to hit me. I saw all the episodes, but it was just overwhelming. Maybe that's the word I want to say. I was really overwhelmed to see, this sort of story of my family on this television where I've watched so many other shows. So I kind of felt like everybody else, but kind of a little bit overwhelmed, almost like I had to pinch myself and couldn't believe it.
Now, did your grandfather or your father even share a little bit about your grandfather's emotional reaction to all the outpouring of fame, appreciation, respect, questions, media? What was going on inside of him? Did you get any sense of that, or did he share that with you?
I think I got, not so much before Roots was published, but I did have the opportunity to, I think it was, I want to say it was a year later, like in 1978, I want to say there was a TV special that came on. I think it was called Roots 1 Year Later, where actually I was in a small segment of that. But there was a period where during that summertime, I did get a chance to travel with him just a little bit when he was on the East Coast, and my father at the time was in the Army. And so we were at Fort Dix, and I think he had, my grandfather had spoken at Fort Dix. My father was stationed there. And I got the sense of like the crush. I didn't understand what that was all about, but we were in this banquet room, and there were, I don't know, it seemed like 30 or 40 tables and hundreds of people there, and he spoke, and his ability to speak and tell stories was absolutely amazing. But what I do remember is that he spoke for an hour or two, and then I remember when we were leaving, it was like a mad crush of people were literally chasing him down the corridor, and I was like right behind him. And it was almost startling to me, because I got a sense then of just how crazy his life is on a day-to-day basis. Like we literally had to escape in a car and kind of drive off.
Like the Beatles.
So that was,
it
was almost like a getaway. So I remember that. And then, there were other times when I traveled with him. It's kind of funny, but not so. It's interesting. I remember we were in the restroom, and he was using the restroom, and a gentleman, nice and polite, went and was asking him for his autograph, in the restroom of all places. So I do remember this, though. I remember that he would often say that the reaction to Roots was completely unexpected. And I think he's even written an article with it where he says, there were days that he wished it wouldn't happen. And he would often say, like in private moments, he was like, I feel like every second or every day, from waking to sleeping with what little sleep that he got, was almost planned for him. So I think on some hand, he didn't expect the reaction. I don't think that he expected the impact of Roots to last so long. I think he thought it might be a brief thing, and then he'd be able to get on and write some other book, right? And, one of the things that he never really got an opportunity to do in his life is to get back to really the very thing that he wanted to do, which was to write. It's almost like Roots took over his entire life, in the sense that, he was out on the road. He spoke literally, I think on average, about 255 days out of the year.
My goodness.
And even at the time of his passing, I recall his calendar was literally booked 2 years in advance of that. So I think on one hand, it was overwhelming, but I think he also was grateful. And then he felt that he had a mission, and he felt that, he was obligated to continue to spread and share, the lessons of Roots, which is about family really, and bringing people together. So, that was his assignment. And, I think, there were times when he, would have wished he could have had maybe a more private solitude sort of life of a writer. But that was just not the lot that he, was meant to have. But I think that he was himself overwhelmed. And, he literally spent the rest of his life sharing Roots with the rest of the world, because there was still that clamoring to understand the story and understand the experience, and to want to see him and hear it again and again. So, it was something that, I guess it was his generational assignment, which is kind of what I feel about where I am in my life at this time.
What is the biggest misconception you think that people have had or had at the time, and maybe even now, had about your grandfather, and even about the topic of Roots? What are some of the, I guess, the pushback, that your grandfather and everyone around him experienced?
I think the one of the larger misconceptions was that Roots was this sort of 100% factual story about strictly my family and the entire journey that it took. My grandfather actually purposely put Roots together, not necessarily to just be a saga or a journey about my family, the Haley family, but he really wanted it to be a metaphor for the journey that families, that all families, particularly people of African, ancestry, took in this country, to sort of give a sense of the journey that they had, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the story of their individual lives. He wanted to encourage people to go back and look at their own individual stories. He wanted it to be inspirational. And one of the things that I think, sometimes, people took it as, this literal documentary of my family. And, one of the misconceptions, and I think, he used this word when he talked about Roots, he used the word faction, which was a combination of the sort of factual history of my family, but also it had fictive elements of it. And, one of the things I think it was promoted as this sort of, factual journey, and the story and the history and the search was, I think that if we would have used the genre that, has become more popular, I mean, Roots is really kind of like this sort of historical, fiction or narrative of a period, of a journey, of a family. But it's also not only a journey of a family of families of African ancestry, but it's a journey in general. So the idea was really to have Roots be a way of having families from everywhere around the world, no matter what corner of the world they were, to be inspired to look at their own individual journeys and understand the nuances of where they came from, like rooting themselves about maybe where they are at that point, but having a curiosity to find out more about their own individual stories. So I think he wrote it as a gift, really, to not only the U.S., to the country, but to the world, for people to celebrate themselves and celebrate, their family. So, there were controversies about it. I know that, there were, various allegations and plagiarism and things of that nature that, that had come up, and those were unfortunate things. But the wider story is about family and roots and history, and having people look at, where they came from and what, they did. And Roots has lasting power. It's amazing that we are approaching 50 years in that it still has popularity, and that people remember when they saw Roots for the first time, or they remember, even when it was done as a remake for A New Generation in 2016, was another exposure to Roots. So it has an enduring power, and it has an enduring legacy. And it's one of the things that I'm most proud of. And I think that if, he was still blessed to be alive, it'd be one of the things that he would be most proud of himself.
Yes. Well, Les, his Baltimore is asking, had your grandfather lived, what do you think his reaction would have been to Amistad 5 years later? I guess, is that the Amistad, the movie, or I guess that, I guess
Right.
the topic of Amistad.
Right. So, I mean, I would say that he would have embraced it as he would have embraced, any story about the narrative of the African journey, of the people journey, of enslavement and slavery, of fighting and for freedom, or any of those things. Like, he didn't intend Roots to be sort of the tell-all, be-all, singular point of referencing the experience of anyone from any corner of the world about their experience, particularly someone of African heritage or ancestry who had ancestors from the continent. So I think he would have wholly embraced it, and he would have loved the impact of it. He would have probably talked about it as he went out and spoke. I mean, he's more typically defined singularly by Roots, and then also, by, as well as the autobiography of Malcolm X. But, he spent a lot of his life editing a lot of different books. I mean, he had this series where he was one of the editors of I think it was a series of stories called Stories of America. And it focused on, people from different cultures, whether it was Native American or it was Irish, or it was various people and their stories around the world. So he was a storyteller by nature. And so he would embrace any good story that was told. And he was an encourager of that. And he gave people, the inspiration and the license to tell their stories. He wanted that. So I think he would have embraced that and anything else that came out that was talking about the experience, because Roots was not the singular definition of the experience. It was just, I want to say it was a door opener. It opened the door for other stories to come through. So he would have appreciated it greatly.
Now we're going to take a little break here, but for our sponsor, Rosetta Universe. But when we come back, I want us to talk a little bit about the Rosetta Stone and the connection to Roots in terms of the beginning stages. And then also about your grandfather going to the UN and just saying a certain word term out and just seeing if anyone heard it. And then a school up in, I think in upper state New York or something like that, met a young man from the Mandingo tribe who understood. Anyway, I want to tease that. And we're going to take a break right now. We're going to hear from the Sphinx of Giza and what the Sphinx has to say about the Rosetta Universe.
The Rosetta Stone provided clues that revealed many of my secrets to a modern world. Come learn how even more ancient mysteries are unlocked by the Rosetta Stone Traveling Exhibit Project.
There we have it, the Sphinx of Giza speaking. The Rosetta Universe, if you go to the QR code above, that'll take you to chiefmischiefmaker.com. You'll be able to learn more about this project. It's a global vision, a grand vision, where we're transforming this ancient artifact into a modern metaphor for problem solving. And I think you'll enjoy that. So I think it's number 1 on the link tree. Then, of course, if you keep on going down to, I think it's show number 32, or 33, I can't remember which, but you'll see the face of Bill Haley Jr. Just gently click it, don't hit it too hard, and it'll take you straight to the website. You can learn more about Alex Haley and about what Bill Jr. is doing at this time, as the baton has been passed to him with this tremendous legacy. So let's kind of take a look at the story of your grandfather going to London. I think it was Playboy had asked him to interview Julie Harris. She was making a movie that was kind of halfway between London and Italy. And she just wasn't, they weren't able to connect. And he was going to see Big Ben and British Museum. And he
Right.
bumped into the Rosetta Stone and
Yes.
kind of take it from there.
Yeah, he was. It was Julie Christie.
Julie Christie. I'm sorry.
Right. And yeah, so he was on assignment. So which actually was a great part of his writing journey, which I really love. But he had an assignment with Playboy to interview Julie Christie, and because she was filming, it was very difficult to get a time and schedule with her. So, being the curiosity and being the curious person that he was, he wandered over to the British Museum, and went and saw amongst everything else the Rosetta Stone, and he said that it hit him when he sparked the idea when he was looking at the Rosetta Stone and realizing how it had translated a language that had not been known. The idea came to him. He said, what if I could somehow find out what these African words are in my oral history story? It would give him a clue, perhaps a deeper clue, as to exactly where his ancestor, the African whose name was Kinteh, had come from. So it totally inspired him. He hadn't really thought about the significance of these words, the Kambi Balongo, what that meant, the core, the Kint, like all of those type of things. He hadn't really thought about that. He was kind of looking at, the other parts of the story. But it excited him, and he immediately, when he went back to New York, as you mentioned, Joel, before, he said, maybe if I find some African who will know, and I say these words to them, they might understand.
And where did he hear these words? Where did he hear these words from?
He heard them as part of the oral history tradition. Wow. that was passed down. So when he was a little boy, even as early as 5 years old, he heard most of the oral history from sitting under the rocking chair, the porch of the house in Henning, from 5 to about 10.
Tennessee, yeah.
And he heard these words, Kambi Balongo. He heard the African story, the oral history repeated over and over and over again. And it didn't click for him until he saw the Rosetta Stone, that perhaps in deciphering the words, as I mentioned, he could find out where it came from. So he found himself, as he was often say, comically with a Tennessee accent in front of the UN, trying to, speak to Africans and try to see if they could perhaps understand what these words meant, where they came from. And they were kind of just shoo him along and, not really pay him any mind. But he was persistent, and he was able to, and at the time he lived up in near Rome, New York at the time. And he would also speak at some of the local colleges. There was a college named Hamilton College, which is up in New York, Hamilton College. And he was directed to, let me back up a little bit. He kind of understood, he was able to get a sense that the words were Mandinkan, and were probably from the Gambia or in that area, the Gambia and Senegal area. And that he understand that Kambi Balongo may have meant Gambia River. So he was directed to a student at Hamilton who was Gambian and might be able to help him. His name was Ibu Manga. And Ibu Manga was a young student. He had just started over at Hamilton, coming abroad from the Gambia. And he was put in contact with Ibu. And my grandfather started telling Ibu the story, and Ibu actually kind of blew him off, like, I don't know what you're talking about, or he didn't think that it was serious or that it really meant anything. But my grandfather was persistent, and so he did take lunch with him, and they kind of talked, and he realized the significance of what the story was that my grandfather had heard, and he was able to say, I know what these words mean. I know some of the words. And he said, well, do you think you could help me maybe find out where in the Gambia they came from. And he said, well, yeah, perhaps I can. So what, I would say Ibu Manga was probably singularly the most important person in the journey of roots in terms of, when we talk about the last mile, the part that connects, the African to the American side of our history. We knew that our ancestor came from the African continent and kind of the Gambia, Senegal area, but we didn't know exactly where. It was because of Ibu and because of his family, the Manga family in the Gambia, which was prominent and known, that, we were able to connect with his family who, like I said, were prominent. And they actually happened to have some of Ibu's relatives were, people who knew surveyors of the Gambia. They knew where all the villages were. They knew, where different places were. And so Ibu literally went ahead to the Gambia, maybe just a few weeks before my grandfather's first trip to the Gambia in 1967. And he met with Ibu's family and he told them the story. Recited the way that he had heard it as a boy in the oral history. And, he was thinking that they were going to focus on, the Kambi Balongo, the Ko, and these other words that he was talking about. But the word that they focused on most was Kinteh.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. The word Kinteh, which they said, well, the Kinteh means that is the surname of your ancestor's family. And that Kinteh meant that they're typically families are reside in villages that were, sort of founded or started way back. And so what they did is they said the Kinteh was the most important part, along with the story about his relative, his ancestor, being kidnapped and, when he was out to make a drum and those type of things. So they literally fanned out and they said, well, we'll go see what we can find and we'll get back in touch with you. So we went back to the US and literally, I think it was about 3 or 4 months later, he received a letter because they were able to find the village of Jufere that had a history they had a Kinteh family there, and who had an oral history of a ancestor who was taken and kidnapped while out to make a drum. And so it was absolutely astonishing. So it was between that, he was able to find that connection. And that's what actually, when he made his second trip to the Gambia, where he was able to then hear with the translations, the oral history of the Kinteh family. And he was able sort of to, based on what their history in terms of tying it to when he was saying the king's soldiers came, to match up what he had heard in America and on the porch in Tennessee to the story that they were telling in the village of Jufere, which was almost like capturing lightning in a bottle. It usually doesn't happen like that. So Ibu Manga was his Rosetta Stone, really, when we think about that. And I will say that that's, and even today, as I talk about the generational assignment, Ibu Manga's son, Malik, and I are working together to celebrate the relationship his dad and my grandfather had as well.
Isn't that something?
And continue the legacy of celebrating the heritage of the 50th anniversary of Roots, which is approaching next year.
I'm just now making that connection.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
he was an absolute, he was the key.
Yes.
That was the translation of that last mile and that last story. I mean, if that had not have happened, I mean, Roots could have still been written and we would have just known that it ended where this ancestor came from, some village in the Gambia, Senegal area, right? But we would not have known where. We would not have known that Kinteh's name, that his name was Kunta, because that wasn't the part that it carried through. The Kinteh did. And the story and the details behind his capture, his kidnapping, those were all sort of very strong details that carried through several hundred years. of history. And I think that that's pretty remarkable that he was so strong-willed to be able to transmit that story through generations, through generations, through generations. And we're lucky in that the Mandinkan people are essentially natural storytellers, and they are preservers of history. It's also one of the things that is known that we talk about griots, and in Mandinkan they call them jellies. But one of the things that was also very interesting, and that's not necessarily known, is that Keba Fofana, who was the person who told my grandfather the story, was he was a cleric, right? He was a Muslim cleric, so he knew how to write in Arabic and read. So in a sense, the story was transmitted verbally as well, but it was also in our family on the Kinteh side. It had been captured actually in Arabic for many years until the books that they had deteriorated, apparently. So that was actually fortuitous that happened, in that we were able to preserve such a rich history on our family. It was just happenstance. It was just, I would say it was God's will that was meant to happen that way.
Now, having the let's flip the channel to you now.
Okay.
Having the last name Haley, I think of two words: burden and blessing. Maybe not in that order, but what and I've worked with pro athletes and their children, and sometimes now grandchildren, and it is so difficult for the next generation to live in the shadow. And it's if it's hot out, you want a shadow. But it's very difficult because of all the pressure that's put on them to perform in a similar fashion, or have the same DNA, the same genetic makeup, and want to approach things in that way. Can you speak to that?
I can't. It's interesting in that, I talked about, there was the day that I was just simply Bill Haley, and then there was the day that Roots was broadcast, and my life changed. So what kind of happened? And this is, I can feel for anyone who is a child or a grandchild of someone who is famous, because what happens is, it was a subtle thing, but it happened fairly quickly, in that you almost become invisible. I want to say that was part of the burden part, was that I became invisible over time, like within that year and forward. And it was sort of in a very subtle way. Not, people were well-meaning, but so if anybody that introduced me to another person would introduce me as Bill Haley before Roots was broadcast, or before the book came out. But after Roots, friends well-meaning, or people, or whoever it were, I stopped becoming Bill Haley.
Yes.
I was known as Alex Haley's grandson. So they stopped seeing me as Bill Haley. They saw me as a relation to someone famous. So it was almost like I became invisible.
And in some ways, to try to use you to get to him, perhaps, and feeling like you have your guard up. Is that part of the picture?
In parts, there was two things. I mean, I remember, I was, like I said, I was a teenager. I was 12. I remember my father having this conversation, like when you talk about the talk,
yes.
he had a different type of talk with me about girls. He said, well, you're going to be very popular, and I just want to make sure I don't show up with any grandchildren any earlier than I need to. So, there was that aspect of it. And I do. And then there were people that, there were lots of requests, like, can you get your grandfather to do this? Can you get him to, to speak here, or do this, or, would he be donating? Can he donate to our organization? So I became like a conduit for various requests, and it was really hard to understand how to handle. And he filled some really, his shadow was huge. So, it took me many years, like you almost go through a trauma where, like I said, I felt invisible, and I wasn't sure where my footing was as a person, being defined by the accomplishments of someone else. As much as I admired my grandfather and was happy about my family history and knowing it, it kind of consumed me, really. And it took me, years, I want to say a decade or more, to where I could kind of come out of that and begin to embrace, kind of figure out who I was, and then grow into the space where I am now, which is understanding that, I have a generational assignment, to pass down the legacy another generation, like through my kids, and to keep roots going. But it was a process. But it was very difficult at first. And I remember always saying, I would never mind being rich, but I don't want to be famous, because I saw what that side of that equation looked like. But it was difficult, but it was illuminating at the same time, in that it gave me compassion for, kind of understanding what that journey was all about, but also how to manage that now in my life. Not that I expect to ever become that famous, but I'd understand how to deal with it better if something, astounding would happen like that.
So what part of the process was, did it move from, let's say, resistance? Some kids, they'll act out, maybe get involved in drugs, alcohol, just kind of drop out and just say, I don't want to be a part of this whole game, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And then it moves to uncertainty, or and then acceptance. Is there some kind of process?
You actually nailed it, Joe. Thank you. So yeah, it was sort of like elation, and then it was being overwhelmed. And so then it went, and so then I kind of hid. I want to say that, like, I just kind of, was putting my ears up to my head. I didn't want to hear anything. I didn't want to know anything.
How did you hide? If someone were looking at your life, how would they know that you were hiding?
Because I didn't talk about roots at all. I didn't talk about my relationship with my like, people didn't know. Although eventually, no matter, like, I wherever I would end up working and whatever it was, I would never deny it. Like, someone might make a connection because they're hearing my last name, or they see me and they might say, "Hey, are you related to Alex Haley?" I mean, I would get that. So I wouldn't deny it, but it wouldn't be the first thing out of my mouth, or the second thing, or the 10th thing, or the 11th thing. I really strove to have people get to know me. So I didn't say anything about roots to people for many, many years, although it would always eventually get out, one way or the other. So that was my way of hiding. And at the same time, it allowed me to kind of become comfortable in my own skin, so that I could grow into a role that I, could move the legacy forward later in my life. So I did resist kind of stepping into that sort of spotlight. So there was a lot of resistance at first. And then, with my father, as I got older, looking at my father's journey, and his was, his saying on his email or his letterhead was like, preserving the legacy. So that kind of stuck with me. And I realized, what he was trying to do. And so, as I looked at my father, moving the legacy forward, I kind of grew into accepting that, that was going to be my role later in life. So I kind of, moved, and I was more sort of accepting and prideful of wanting to embrace it at that point. And, it kind of led me to where I am today.
So when people would come up to you, did you kind of treat it like a game to kind of see how long you could keep your anonymity, or how did you work that, try to figure that out?
Well, like I said, people came up to me and said, "Hey, said, are you related to Alex Haley, or I heard, or whatever," I would say, yeah. And they would start asking questions, and I would, when I said I was resisting it, I would just kind of try to shut down and divert the conversation somewhere else. I didn't really talk about it, at all. But it always inevitably crept up. I mean, I remember just going into just social occasions or parties, and I would step in, and that was like, people would know, and it would be like the first thing they said. So then, the cat was out of the bag, so to speak. And I just had to just endure and deal with, the 50 million questions. And, like I said, so eventually, I just, I just gave in. I'll
Hmm.
say it like that. I just realized that this was not going to go away,
Hmm.
and that I could either, try to avoid it or let other people direct how that experience was going to be for me, or that I could embrace it and
Hmm.
direct the experience and have it the way that I would want it to be. So that was, I would say, that's been kind of the journey, but I had to kind of become comfortable in my own shoes.
Hmm.
Um, so that
Yeah,
that kind of encapsulate the way it was for me, Joel.
there's kind of a difference, I think, between resignation and acceptance. Don't
Mhm.
you think? Resignation
Yeah,
is like, oh, here, okay, okay, here we got, I got this assignment or whatever it is, versus acceptance, embracing it.
yes.
You used that term, embracing,
Mhm.
just a few moments ago. Can you kind of give us some ideas around that? Because I'm just thinking, there are people, there's different levels of this kind of thing, in
Sure.
some cultures and some families, it's you're going to be a doctor, your dad was a doctor, your grandfather's a doctor, and it's on a different level. But for people listening around the world right now, can you speak to that, the older generation and the younger generation? Can you kind of have a message to both of them on how to navigate that?
Yeah. So I would say, for for anyone that was like older generation, I would say, certainly, uh, as you mentioned, having a sort of, I would say always, I would say I would hold, the younger generation to those standards, those same things. Like, if um, I'll give you a perfect example. So when Roots came out, all of a sudden I was supposed to be a writer, right? I mean, everyone, like, pegged me. I was going to be this writer, and that's where I should go, and that's what I should do. Um, and I want to contrast that, and I wouldn't say I was resistant to the idea. I don't consider myself a writer at all. I mean, I can put together a few words here and there, but I would say from an older generation, I say it's always great to have, um, to set expectations, right, and to set um, goals for, for the future of the younger generations. Um, so I wouldn't necessarily. I would say there's nothing wrong with doing that. Um, and I would say the same sort of things were put upon me. Um, you're going to be a writer. I was going to be this fantastic person. I was going to accomplish all these things, and I kind of was more. I'm creatively focused, almost like my grandfather was. Like,
Mm,
his brothers were very task focused. His brother George became a lawyer because he was very focused on doing that. His brother Julius became an architect because he was focused on doing something like that. Where my grandfather grew up is, he would say he was sort of uh, the creative flake. He was the
mhm,
imagine. He had the
mhm,
imagination, and I'm kind of like that. Like, I kind of think about possibilities and what can happen
mhm,
and what could become. What's possible. I would say, although like I said, I had expectations set upon me. My own personal thing, and this kind of speaks to the younger people all over the world, is to say, um, you know, you can be grounded in what your the older people and the elders tell you. I mean, in a sense, because it means regardless of what they're saying about what you want to do and what they think you should be, behind all of that is simply setting a set of expectations about achieving something. Now, I would also say for younger folks is to make sure that you're always activating and using your imagination
mm,
all over the world, and remembering that anything is possible. Like, I don't think that my grandfather had no idea, no sense at all that his journey was going to take him where he wanted to be. I mean, he wound up in the Coast Guard actually because he
mm,
was not a great college student, and
mm,
his father, who was a professor of agriculture and taught at land grant colleges, HBCUs all over the country, wasn't having it.
mm,
So he went to the Coast Guard to get himself straightened out. Little
mhm.
did he know that that was how and where he was going to go on his writing journey,
Isn't
and
that
turn
something?
him into, the writer he became, and achieve him becoming the Coast Guard's first chief journalist, and taking him on his early writing career Reader's Digest and Playboy and the autobiography of Malcolm X and then later Roots. So, and when I say about using your imagination, he took the same, and I'll say it this way, Joel, and I hope I can put a little bit of a fine point. His father had a specific, my great-grandfather Simon had a very specific expectation. He wanted his son, my grandfather, to be a college professor like him, right? So the discipline of doing that, the expectation of doing that, I would say transformed itself in a different way. He took the Coast Guard journey, he took the writing journey, but I would say to anyone around the world that he took the same discipline and applied that to his writing that his father applied to becoming a professor of agriculture. So I'm saying you can take those elements, the mission, the determination, the goals, and keep those, but make it your own, and utilize that and become all that you can become. And so I think that's what he did. He honored his father, but in a way that was unexpected.
Yes.
And I think it wasn't until Roots was published that is, my great grandfather was like, yeah, okay, he had accomplished something. So, so I would say that. I hope that kind of,
that's perfect. Thank you. Well, we have about 2 minutes left. How do you balance retaining and expanding on your grandfather's legacy and your dad's legacy, and at the same time creating your own legacy?
I'd say that my goal is to continue to actually just to do what the generations before did. So like I say, I feel like I have a generational assignment, and since my grandfather had a generational assignment that was passed down to him, whether that was from his grandmother, and that was passed down from Tom Murray, from Chicken George, and all that. So there's a generational assignment to do that, and so I would say that part of my goal is to continue to do that, particularly have people connect with other people in their family, understand what their inherited roots are, and that means discovering their roots. And it's part of it. I mean, there's so many technologies there that are out now. There's the DNA part. There's opportunities to find out the four corners of the world where we all came from. But I would say the most important part is I want to make sure that people continue to do what my grandfather did, which is you want to talk to those people, the older people in your family, find out those oral histories, get those stories written down. There are lots of documents out, but then there are lots of documents where they don't speak to you. They can't tell you what happened. So I would encourage everybody to go and talk to the older folks in their family, find out their history, their story, and use a little trick. Take photos. We find photos everywhere. One of the easiest ways to get older folks to remember things that they don't think about is to find some older photo and use that photo to begin asking questions. Beautiful. And inquire, because the brain and the mind opens up in such a different way. If you just ask somebody cold, tell me what it was like when you were 5 years old, as opposed to showing them a picture when they were approximately 5 years old, because they're going to remember the time where they were, who they were around. It opens up the memory in an entire different way. So part of my mission is to continue to essentially pass on that process and have people discover more about who they are all over the world. And bring some attention back to the continent, to the Gambia, to West Africa, and also just bring people together from all corners of the world. I mean, it's amazing that Roots was published. It's universal. It's published in 37 languages.
Crazy, incredible.
Okay, it's published in 37 languages. So it's not just a Black story. It's the story of humanity, of humankind, of people. Yeah. So that's the message that I want to make sure that we impart. As I celebrate the 50th anniversary of Roots and Beyond.
Bill, it is so great. I've been anticipating this show, and I just really appreciate you spending the time with us here on the Mischief Maker Show, and really appreciate you and love you. God bless.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you. You're a blessing. I appreciate you.
Well, folks, next time we're going to have someone by the name of Oz Guinness. He's, I think, the great great grandson of the Guinness Ale Company organization, or whatever you want to call it. But we're going to talk about doubt and the different. See you next time. Ibidi. That's all, folks.
You have just experienced another episode of the Mischief Maker broadcast. Hit the subscribe button. Connect at chiefmischiefmaker.com. Thanks for coming along for the ride. And hopefully, you are now a bit closer to becoming a mischief maker in your part of the world.